You may be aware that convicts from Britain helped colonize Australia, but you probably have no clue about the savagery that ensued aboard those ships, particularly the first one carrying female inmates. The convict colony of New South Wales was in dire need of reform, so Great Britain dispatched a motley crew of British women, mostly sex workers and minor thieves, to help. Furthermore, the complexity, tragedy, and triumph of their journey will astound you. Today we're going on an adventure to learn more about the horrific and untamed life of the Lady Juliana, a unique prison ship that transported female inmates to Australia in the 18th century. Make sure you're a subscriber to the Reality Threads channel before we begin. If that isn't enough, please tell us in the comments what you would want to read about. Hey there, pal. It's time to board the Lady Juliana, a renegade prison ship full of women from the late 18th century. Considering that you couldn't really take a jet in the 18th century, the journey from England to Australia took around 10 excruciatingly long months. Port calls on the Lady's transoceanic voyage included stops at Rio de Janeiro and Cape Town, among others. These docking locations weren't just temporary rest areas where travelers could buy trinkets and get some fresh air. Sometimes they lasted for weeks. As part of their world tour, several incarcerated women took advantage of one of the few employment opportunities accessible to them. We did not prohibit the folks on shore from boarding during the day, the ship's steward, John Nicole, euphemistically recalled. There were a lot of visits from the captains and sailors that were in port during that time. The women retained a portion of their profits. Some male officers and sailors on board reportedly took part in the affair. Their participation unfortunately begs the question, how much pressure were these abducted women subjected to? So many of the women on board became the spouses of the officers and crew members, whether it was out of love, desire, coercion, boredom, or sheer necessity. When we were fully out at sea, every man on board took a wife from among the prisoners, recounted John Nicole, the ship's steward, in his story of the voyage. They have no qualms about it. Even though these marriages were clearly illegal, the convicted ladies occasionally benefited from them. It was common practice to upgrade your sleeping quarters when you brought a romantic partner on board. At least one relationship, though, was based on genuine affection. It appeared that Nicole, the ship's steward whom we previously mentioned, had developed romantic feelings for Sarah Whitlam, a prisoner. Unfortunately, he never got around to marrying her when her tenure finished. Whitlam and their child remained in Australia while Nicole returned to Britain. He desperately sought her out in the hopes of reconciling, but alas, they were never to meet again. With a pregnant woman and a convicted felon added to the mix, it's almost like the plot of Titanic. The majority of the partnerships on board were not quite as tragic as Nicole and Whitlam's love tale, so be warned if you're captivated by it. Inmates on convict ships did not have much privacy. They were easily accessible to crew members, and their relationships and interactions might not have received their consent. Despite the pathetic 10-year-old consent age in 18th century Britain, some crew members shamelessly brought teenage wives on the voyage. One such young wife, documented by historian Pamela Horn, was Jane Forbes, who gave birth before ever setting foot in Australia. She was just 14 years old. There was a specific mission for the Lady Juliana's women. The colonizers' goal was that the influx of female convicts would help bring the new colony up to modern standards. They may have hoped these women would steal some hearts, given that most of them were petty criminals. An official from the British government once said that more women in leadership positions would promote a matrimonial connection to improve morals and secure a settlement. The intention was to establish and uphold decent family values in the new colony by marrying off the women to the male immigrants. In order to facilitate the restoration of the British family unit overseas, their prison terms were designed to mold them into moral receptacles. While the crimes committed by the women on board the Lady Juliana, who were en route to New South Wales, may not have seemed significant from our modern perspective, they had the power to upend their lives. Their trip to Australia was unrelated to the Lady Juliana's possible sex workers. There was no transient crime involving sex work, also known as harlotry. Indeed, the ship had apprehended and penalized the majority of the female crew members for varying degrees of stealing. Their crimes encompassed a wide spectrum, including shoplifting, pickpocketing, and highway robbery. As an example, Mary Hook was sentenced to 7 years in New South Wales instead of the death penalty for stealing from her employer when she was about 20 years old. According to a British court, she nearly lost her life because she stole a few items from her workplace. Thankfully, the British government relocated her to a foreign continent. Elizabeth Barnsley stood out among the other inmates on board. The jury found her guilty of the heinous and dangerous crime of stealing some fabric. By the end of the journey, Liz, the cloth thief, had established herself as a leader. She had a generous spirit toward her impoverished fellow inmates, as described by John Nicole in his writings on her. Everyone was eager to help her. In their midst, she acted as queen. Barnsley, who became a madam during her time on the ship, played a key role in regulating the inmates' business dealings at each port they stopped at. Despite the fact that they were not being brought to New South Wales for prostitution, it is possible that many of the women on board the Lady Juliana were sex workers, along with their other minor transgressions. It is likely that some of the more than 200 inmates were involved in the thriving harlotry industry that flourished in 18th century Britain. The ladies on board the Lady Juliana were rescued from British prisons. Their fugitive prison was in appalling condition, even though a reform movement to improve prison conditions was taking root in the late 18th century. Overcrowding in prisons facilitated the rapid spread of disease. The mere act of being a prisoner carried the inherent risk of being sentenced to death. Indeed, it remained a prison ship. Inmates slept directly above the ship's sewage and refuse deck, as one might expect. However, in contrast to their peers on land and in prison, the ladies of the Lady Juliana enjoyed constant access to medical treatment. They had a surgeon on board and kept the ship reasonably sanitary. In addition, unlike on other convict ships, the women weren't shackled, and they had the opportunity to bargain for better treatment in exchange for certain favors. The Lady Juliana's passengers had it better than those on the other Second Fleet ships because it was governed by the British government. The infamous and prolific slave trading business, Camden, Calvert, and King, ran all the other ships. The Lady Juliana had a much lower death toll than the other ships, with only 5 women losing their lives. Even though it wasn't a carnival cruise, the fact that most of the women survived is a plus. One such adolescent, who may have been as young as 11 years old on board, was Mary Wade. Still, her precise age is a topic of controversy among scholars. The ship's youngest passenger was Mary. Like many of her fellow sailors, Wade married and raised a large family in Australia. During its 11-month cruise, the Lady Juliana encountered few problems, but one significant one was inebriation, resulting in disorderly conduct. However, when you're on a ship filled with hip criminal women, it's only natural to want to share a few tequila shots with your friends. In an attempt to curb her alleged disruptive behavior, they forced passenger Nance Farrell to wear a recycled oak barrel jacket. After that failed, they finally flogged her 12 times. Oh my goodness. Several of the ladies on board the Lady Juliana had children of their own before the ship left England. The lengthy journey caused many of the inmate passengers to become pregnant, and some even gave birth. Most historians agree that the ship produced 5 or 7 infants, but steward John Nicole claimed that at least 20 had been born when the ship was docked at Rio. They were ready for the arrival of the babies because, prior to departing from England, the ship had been given some baby linens. The idea of water births takes on a completely new significance in light of this. Despite having few rights as prisoners and being assigned to difficult and often dangerous jobs, the ladies of the Lady Juliana soon discovered that they could enjoy freedoms in their new country of New South Wales that they couldn't enjoy in England. Australian colonial authorities looked to women to be moral compass points, but upon arrival, they found themselves liberated from some British moral codes. For instance, they did not strictly enforce English laws that designated offspring of unmarried mothers as illegitimate. Despite the undeniable hardship of being forcibly transferred to a foreign colony in order to marry and spread the ideals of the British family, numerous women thrived in their new home in Australia. Once their sentences ended, some passengers on the Lady Juliana became economically independent and even formed their own enterprises. For example, after her ship husband left her, Anne Marsh went on to achieve enormous success. A booze store and a ferry firm were just 2 of the many enterprises she launched and oversaw. Despite the horrific ordeal they endured, the women's voyage changed the trajectory of history and left an indelible mark on Australia. Many Australians consider the ladies of the Lady Juliana to be the country's first mothers. Their trip will go down in history as one of the most famous, due to their romantic bargaining while on board and their side hustles in ports of call. What are your thoughts on the ladies featured in Lady Juliana? Tell us down in the comments. Also, watch a few more videos by Our Reality Threads while you're here.